CoronaTube is back for a final episode. Yes, you've heard right, this is the final episode of CoronaTube. That means we've had 6 episodes, and today we'd like to look back on what we've experienced over the past 1.5 years. A year ago, the first episode of CoronaTube came out at a time when COVID was already keeping us pretty busy. Now a bit of time has passed, so we'd like to draw some conclusions and have a look at what's to come. Would you like to know what COVID is doing to our lives? Our team from CoronaTube Saxony will let you know. I'm Holger. And this is Mike. Let's go! Yes, you've heard right. We've been living with the pandemic for 1.5 years. Time for a review. In Saxony, it all began on the 2nd of March 2020, when we've had the first case of COVID. In mid-March, the first person died of COVID-19, and Saxony experienced its first lockdown. Schools were shut down, large gatherings were banned, and public institutions were closed. Nevertheless, during all lockdowns, essential businesses remained open, and enough food was available at all times. The first measure against the pandemic was the introduction of obligatory face masks in April. At the end of April, fines were introduced for breaches of the Saxon Corona regulation. By the end of April, the first pupils were allowed to return to school. As temperatures rose and infection rates began to drop a bit, furniture stores were opened under certain conditions. The same applied to zoos and shopping centers. At the same time, the responsible ministries were working on hygiene measures to enable the implementation of tougher rules, which meant that hotels and restaurants were able to reopen in mid-May. Kids went back to kindergarten and pupils could return to primary school. Hybrid classes, which took place online and in school, affected the remaining pupils. As in 2021, infection rates really went down around Whitsun, and lots of people used the chance to go on holiday and enjoy the summer. When summer starts, public pools, saunas and baths reopened their doors to visitors. In June, large family gatherings were allowed to take place and music venues reopened. Dancing events continued to be banned though, and this step was mostly about concerts and lots of social distancing and a small audience. In August, the second wave started. Infection rates rose as people returned from their holidays. Nevertheless, pupils returned to a normal school schedule after the summer break. Fines were introduced for people who refused to put on their masks on public transport. We've had an episode on CoronaTube on COVID and public transport, where we told you about it already. But getting back to schools, by the end of September infection rates were rising rapidly, and schools as well as care homes were the main drivers of infections. The Mountain Erzgebirge region was particularly affected by rising infection rates, and became the first district to be declared a risk region. In autumn, or November to be more precise, a partial lockdown was implemented, and cultural life came to a standstill. If you would like to know more about that, have a look back on our episode on the consequences of the pandemic on the cultural landscape of Saxony. In early December, COVID regulations were once again tightened. Infections figures were going through the roof. Hospitals were reaching their limits and the capacity of intensive care beds became exhausted. The 7-day incidence rates for Saxony passed 240. The new measures against the pandemic included a partial curfew and a ban on alcohol in public spaces. During the winter, Saxony became Germany's COVID hotspot. The 7-day incidence figure for Saxony was over 300, passing 500 in some regions. Public life was further limited to somehow get a grip on the pandemic. If you've seen our episode from the winter, you'll know that by the end of December the vaccination program had begun in Saxony. So now we're in 2021 already. The lockdown was further extended and Saxon vaccination centers became operational. There were quite a few problems though, because with the high demand for appointments, the booking website was constantly overloaded. That made it pretty hard to get an appointment. There was also an episode on mutations and mutant variants on the coronavirus. By the end of January, the first cases of the so-called British variant had reached Saxony. Because of the consistently high infection figures, more and more employers began to adapt their work model, permitting and sometimes obliging their staff to work from home. Simple handmade cotton masks became insufficient for entering shops and supermarkets, and medical or FFP2 masks were made compulsory. At the beginning of February, it was decided to start the winter break 1 week early. To limit the economic fallout of the pandemic, shops were allowed to offer pick-up services for customers. The vaccination program gathered speed, and free testing was further meant to permit the containment of the pandemic. Due to rising infection rates, the new Federal Infection Protection Act entered into force, as well as the Federal Emergency Brake. By the end of May, risk groups were mostly vaccinated and vaccine prioritization was lifted, permitting all adults in Saxony to be vaccinated. During the summer, infection rates remained low, but a further wave of the pandemic is expected. This is driven by the Delta variant, which is currently dominating the pandemic in Germany. The dangerous thing about this variant is the increased risk of infection and its higher transmissibility. Thank you, Holger. Scientists are in agreement that the fourth wave is coming. How severe this fourth wave will be is in our hands. Fortunately, we are far better prepared for the fourth wave than we were last year. We now know about the effectiveness of public health measures, and vaccinations provide us with a mighty weapon. The important thing is that more people get vaccinated and that more people protect others and themselves by getting their jab. What is also becoming more and more clear is that COVID is here to stay. Things won't go back to the way they were, and we have to learn to live with COVID. Hope remains that COVID will eventually become endemic, and that we will deal with COVID as we do with other illnesses. There is a lot of potential to develop better medicine to treat COVID, and progress is being made in treating long COVID as well. So at the end of this episode, we've got a little premiere for you. You've never seen the two of us behind the camera, or rather in front of the camera. That's why we want to say in the final episode, many thanks to everyone who's been watching CoronaTube. We hope that you've been able to benefit from our channel, and we wish you all the best. Stay healthy, take care of yourselves and those around you. Take care. So one final addition to our episode of CoronaTube. On the way back to the office, we noticed a lot of masks just end up in the environment. Wearing a mask is a good thing, but please don't do this. Just put them in your bin at home. This is just on the side, but please protect the environment as well as yourselves. Take care.